Evening, and thank you all for coming and helping set up the room. That's normally not part of the procedure, but we're deeply grateful. So as I mentioned before, my name is Mati Banzo. I have the pleasure and privilege directing the program in Jewish Culture and Society. And the only thing I'm going to say is thank you to the Krouse family, Paul and Ann Krouse, who created the endowment that has allowed us to bring some of the great scholars in Jewish studies to the University of Illinois over the years. Scholars including folks like Daniel Boyarin, Jan Gross, Omer Bartov, Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimbel, Susanna Heschel, Hasha Diner. It's a wonderful, illustrious list, and it is being continued this week with one of the scholars we all admire tremendously, and it's a great, great honor to have Paul Mendes-Flohr with us. I'm going to head the microphone, I'm going to move out of the way, and the person who's going to introduce Professor Mendes-Flohr is Dov Weiss, who many of you know as our brilliant young professor in the religion department. He teaches Judaism as an assistant professor. He is starting his third year, and we're so happy to have Dov, and he would be the obvious person to introduce Professor Mendes-Flohr, but it's even more appropriate because Dov was actually Professor Mendes-Flohr's student at the University of Chicago. So this is one of those wonderful moments when where we can get a sense of an intellectual genealogy at work. So Dov, come on up, and thank you all for coming.
I'm going to move this up, I think. No? A little bit, a little bit. It's all good, it's all good. Okay. I think we're good. All right.
We're going to have to redo the camera now.
Oh, is it really messed up? Oh boy. I didn't realize that.
It shows you from the neck down.
How about now?
Now it's really good.
All right. All right, okay. Listen, that was 1 for 2, you know. Thank you, Mati. On behalf of the program in Jewish Culture and Society, I'm deeply privileged and honored to introduce Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr to deliver our annual Krouse Family Lecture in Judaism and Western Culture. Professor Mendes-Flohr is the Dorothy Grant McClear Professor of Modern Jewish History and Thought at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and is Professor Emeritus of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
How's it going?
All right.
It's your fault.
Okay. Professor Mendes-Flohr received his BA from Brooklyn College and his doctorate from Brandeis University. He's the author of such seminal books as From Mysticism to Dialogue, Martin Buber's Transformation of German Social Thought, published by Wayne State Press in 1989, Divided Passions, Jewish Intellectuals and the Experience of Modernity, also by Wayne State Press in 1991, and German Jews, A Dual Identity, published by Yale Press in 1999. In addition, he has edited dozens of books and published countless articles on the most important thinkers in modern Judaism, including Moses Mendelssohn, Franz Rosenzweig, Gershom Scholem, Leo Strauss, and Martin Buber. And most famously, he co-edited with Judah Reinhardt's the groundbreaking work, The Jew in the Modern World, a documentary history which collects, translates, and annotates the most essential Jewish writings of the modern period. And it most recently was reprinted, the 3rd edition, published by Oxford University Press in 2010. This work, The Jew in the Modern World, is considered by many, i.e. my friends and I, as the Tanakh of modern Judaism, and is used in virtually every university course in modern Jewish history. Professor Mendes-Flohr's major research interests include modern Jewish intellectual history, modern Jewish philosophy and religious thought, philosophy of religion, German intellectual history, and the history and sociology of intellectuals. Together with Bernard Witte, he serves as editor-in-chief of the 22-volume German edition of the collected works of Martin Buber. He is also the editor of a series on German Jewish literature and cultural history for the University of Chicago Press. He's completing a biography of Martin Buber to be published by Yale Press. And finally, he's working on 2 edited volumes, one on Gustav Landauer and another on dialogue as a transdisciplinary concept. And I can go on and on and on, but I'll leave it at that. Permit me now to say a few personal words about Professor Mendes-Flohr as an advisor, teacher, and mentor. I entered the University of Chicago Divinity School in 2004 after completing 9 years of studying and teaching in various Orthodox rabbinical schools. My exposure to classical and modern Jewish thought was an Orthodox exposure, and my engagement with liberal Jewish thinkers was minimal. Upon entering the graduate program at U of C, all that quickly changed. For the following 4 years, Professor Mendes-Flohr, with an unusual passion, joy, and love, taught me the inspiring and brilliant Torah from the great scholars of people like Mendelssohn and Cohen and Buber, Sholem Rosenzweig Kaplan, and other non-Orthodox Jewish thinkers of the 18th to 20th century, who, while engaging the canon of Western intellectual thought, also sought ways to make Judaism coherent and meaningful in the age of modernity. And what is truly remarkable about Professor Mendes-Flohr is that he does not merely teach and research modern Jewish thought, but he also lives, embodies, and internalizes many of its values and ideas. For him, Torah is an Eitz Chaim, it's a way of life, and not just a discipline of the mind. Martin Buber is not just a subject of scholarship, as we'll hear today, but Martin Buber for him is a reservoir of spiritual wisdom. As a Buber chassid, Paul lives his life encountering the other person as a thou, rather than an it. And this is the manner in which he always relates to his students. When I attended graduate school, I encountered a world-renowned scholar who showered so much care and love onto his disciples. With great sensitivity, he would at times challenge our work, but he always stressed and emphasized the areas and things that we were getting right. We really felt that he believed in us, and that he was deeply confident that we would succeed. Professor Mendes-Flohr is an unusually kind and soft-spoken man who carries himself with an unusual humility. He embodies the famous line in the Talmud which says that true greatness emerges only when humility can be found together with that brilliance. I can vividly recall my first semester at the university. I took a course with Professor Mendes-Flohr, Modern Jewish Conceptions of Judaism, and I was quite anxious about what my paper topic should be. After class, I approached him and asked him for advice. I said, Professor Mendes-Flohr, I'm perplexed about what topic I should write on. Should I do Mendelssohn's Jerusalem or Spinoza's Tractatus? And his answer really startled me. He said, Dov, before we get into those details, let me ask you a more crucial question. How are you doing? Are you happy here at the university? That, he said, is far more important than your paper topic. I'll never forget that moment. In the world of academia, it is rare that one encounters an individual who interfaces genius of the mind with an open and caring heart. This synthesis is a fundamental teaching of Dr. Paul Mendes-Flohr, a synthesis that has served as an inspiration for me to strive to emulate. So on a personal level, Professor Mendes-Flohr, I want to publicly thank you. I'm deeply grateful for all that you have taught me and all that you have modeled for me, both inside the classroom and perhaps more importantly outside the classroom. What an honor then it is for me, as we say in Hebrew, what a zechut it is to introduce you. Of course, it's an honor not just for me and the program of Jewish Studies, but for all of us here at the University of Illinois. The lecture is titled Martin Buber's Philosophy of Dialogue Today, and let us give a warm welcome to Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr.
I must admit I'm moved. I wish my grandchildren, I have 4 grandchildren who reside in this realm. My oldest granddaughter is now marching somewhere in India, but they should have heard what that. Fortunately, it's on tape. One of Buber's disciples was a man named Ernst Simon, with whom I was very close in Jerusalem. And he would often say, this is apropos of Dove's comments, that humility is one of my great virtues. I'm not certain, but nonetheless. Dove mentioned that I had introduced him to the modern Jewish sensibility, but Dove also brought to the University of Chicago the refinement, the elevated quality, spiritual quality of Jewish tradition. Anytime I would walk with Dov, he said, I have to carry your books, this Lechod Rav, in honor of the rabbi. And it would embarrass me, but he would grab my books and carry them, record them. So Dov has his own, makes his own distinctive contribution to the world of Judaism and of the world in general. So I think you all recognize and acknowledge his humanity, which is indeed nurtured by the tradition. I'm a little embarrassed that I'm going to dress with a tie. I really don't wear a tie ever. But since he came with such a gracious invitation, I felt obliged to buy a new shirt and such. Which reminds me of when I've lived in Israel for 45 years, and my home still is in Jerusalem, and I just come 4 months a year to Chicago when my wife and children allow me. But when I was a student in the United States, it was a period of the Vietnamese War, and we had problems with Lyndon Johnson. And it was said that when Lyndon Johnson would give a news conference and would scratch his head, he knew he was telling the truth. When he would go like this, he knew he was telling the truth. When he removed his jacket, you knew he was telling the truth. And removed his tie, he certainly was telling the truth. When he began to move his lips, you knew he was telling a lie. Now, how is that relevant other than trying to make myself feel comfortable? It is relevant to Buber because often what we call dialogue is not a question of speech, but of those visceral gestures, and I'll expand upon that. But let me begin what I actually wanted to tell you. It's said that when Martin Buber would walk down the streets of Jerusalem, he came to Israel at the age of 60 in 1938. He was already a famous man and had, I don't know if you can see this, but he has a beautiful long white beard. And children would run after him and say, Elohim, Elohim, God, God. And Buber would turn around, stroke his beard, and say, yes. Of course, he didn't consider himself divine, nor even a prophet, although he was often perceived as such. But he did say, and I'll expand upon this later, that all of us, Jews and non-Jews, are the children of prophets. As he would put it in Hebrew, B'nei Amos anachnu. We are the children of Amos the prophet. Buber came to that position serendipitously, by accident. He was not by disposition, personality, at all dialogical. He had difficulty communicating with others. And in fact, when he came to the concept of dialogue, it was after a long personal journey. The reason he had this beautiful beard is not because he wanted to be a prophet, nor was he, in that sense, a pious Jew. He was born with at his birth, there was an accident and his lip was twisted, and he had a speech defect as well. As soon as he was able to grow a mustache, he tried that, and it didn't work quite. So he had eventually a beard to cover up the twisted lip. And he would practice speaking slowly and distinctively to overcome his birth defect. But it also affected the way he interacted with people. He was shy, uncertain. That was compounded by the fact that at the age of 3, his parents had a precipitous separation. And he recalled that when his mother fled the home in Vienna, he ran to the balcony, trying to gain her attention, and she never turned around to respond. That sense of what he would eventually call a mismeeting or a lack of a meeting, a dialogical meeting, imprinted itself on his psyche, if you wish, his consciousness, his sensibilities, and you'll see how it registers in his notion of dialogue. So he had difficulty in interpersonal relations. As a child, after the divorce, he was sent to live with his grandparents in an area we now call Poland or Ukraine. Was then part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He was raised speaking Yiddish, not German, and he went to school in Polish. And I just mention that because he's often perceived as a German Jew, which he wasn't. He did much of his intellectual activity in German, but he was not a German Jew, and I'll return to that shortly. What is significant is that when he lived with his grandparents, they sheltered him. He had very little contact with other children. Again, that has indicated his difficulty his later difficulties in being dialogical, relating. I mention that because he's aware of the difficulties, the challenge of what he would call dialogue. He found security intellectually. He was a very good student. As soon as he got to the university, he plugged away. He got good grades. And the security was in his intellectual engagement and acclaim. His fame, which came very early in his life, was a source of security, if you wish. Maybe a delusory security. I would refer to it as a narcissistic security, which, of course, all of us, to one measure, one degree or another, are guilty of. You may have noticed I have very beautiful French glasses, actually Belgian glasses. I took a long time to select them, and admittedly out of narcissistic inclinations. Of course, it can be a source of great anxiety and ultimately insecurity. Well, maybe my glasses are not that attractive. But that's quite typical, of course, particularly in, if we're going to use the expression, bourgeois circles. That, if you wish, posture, form of defense for ultimately a very insecure person was broken down by a variety of events, as Buber later told us. One was during the war, the First World War. As you recall, it commenced, it convulsed, erupted in August 1914. In the midst of the war, around 1916, Buber, who was a workaholic, was visited unexpectedly by a distraught soldier. Came knocking on his door at 6 o'clock in the morning, which is, of course, a little bit, how would you say, impolite, and especially for a German intellectual. Buber was posing as a German intellectual, trying to hide his Yiddish accent. One would have to make an appointment. And certainly that should show up suddenly at 6 in the morning. Nonetheless, Buber perceived that the man was in distress, and he invited him into his study. He says, well, I have a half hour I can give you, and I should have brought my pocket watch. But he gave the man that half hour. And he was cordial, polite, in some sense attentive. And after a half hour, he signaled by looking at his pocket watch. Maybe your teachers do that, I don't know, I hope not, but probably do, I do, despite what most would say. And he signaled to the young man that time was up. Buber felt that he was decent. 6 o'clock in the morning, unannounced, he received the man with a certain degree of cordiality. And the following day, Buber learned that this distraught man had committed suicide, had taken his life. And Buber realized that although he responded to all the questions the man posed, I'd asked him, he really failed to respond to the questions which were not verbalized, but, so to speak, etched in the man's forehead, in his eyes, in his body language. this was the seed, one of the seeds leading to the notion of dialogue. Another event took place a month before the First World War. Remember I told you, well you know of course, but I just remind you, it broke out in August 1914. In July of 1914, there was a great deal of rumors about the possibility of a convulsion, a war. And Buber was visited at the time by a very famous cleric, a man named Reverend Hechler, who was the father confessor of the Kaiser. At the time, Germany had an emperor. But Reverend Hechler was also a supporter of the nascent movement called Zionism, which sought the renewal of the Jewish people in their ancestral home in Palestine. Reverend Hechler's support for Zionism was based on evangelical Christian notions that of the coming of the Messiah, and that with the Jewish Messiah, which of course is ultimately the Christian Messiah, and that would lead to not only the redemption of the Jewish people, but of course the great event known as the Parousia. And he came to Buber, and he was an older man in his late 70s, and Buber still in his early 30s, excited. He's coming, he's coming. And he began to quote from the book of Daniel and other apocalyptic literature, pointing to the advent of the Messiah. One feature of the apocalyptic literature, as you undoubtedly know, is that the redemption, the coming of the Messiah, is preceded by what we call the birth pangs of the Messiah, such as that glorious moment of a woman's life. She goes through tremendous pain to give birth to a child. So the birth pangs of the Messiah refer to the cataclysmic events preceding the redemption. War's coming, but it's an apocalyptic war. It is the birth pangs of the Messiah. And then Buber goes on to say that he was baffled. He didn't really know how to respond to this enthusiastic reverend and one of the few non-Jewish supporters of the nascent movement of Zionism. And as he was walking, accompanying Reverend Hechler back to the train, Reverend Hechler turned to him and said, "Tell me here, Buber," he already had a doctorate, "Tell me here, Dr. Buber, do you believe in God?" And Buber broke out in a cold sweat. He didn't know how to respond, but he mumbled one of those ambiguities that says yes. At least he hoped it was heard as a yes. And then he returned home and he said, "Why couldn't I say yes? Why couldn't I unambiguously say yes? After all, I write about God, I write literature about the Hasidim, the Jewish pious mystical sect of the 18th century Poland. Why couldn't I say, what we say in Hebrew, befemele, with a full, unadulterated yes, valuable yes?" And Buber then said that the answer came to him 2 years later, unexpected. He was in a train and suddenly the answer came. And the answer was, if to speak about God in the third person, God says this, God does this, I cannot say I believe in God. But if we mean by belief in God that God addresses us in the second person, direct speech to me, in his case, Martin, or in Hebrew, Mordechai, then I do believe in God. The third person is metaphysical. It's based on speculation, theological constructs. That Buber had difficulty with. But to feel that you are addressed by the divine and that you are called upon to respond to that address was another insight that led to Buber's concept of dialogue. His concept of dialogue, as Dov mentioned, and Mati as well, and I want to say, Mati, thank you for your warm invitation and all the warmth that accompanied the arrangements and the solicitation of my visit. So thank you, Mati. But Mati mentioned the I vow. Buber gave first expression to his new insight, I am vow, when he was just before his 46th birthday. Now, from the perspective of younger people, that's mid-age. I look back with envy for anyone who's still in their 40s. I'm now in my 8th decade, I guess. My knees are also going. But it's still in middle age, and Buber had already written at the time 800 books and essays. He was an accomplished philosopher, more in the direction of some sort of mystical experience, that the world we live in, the everyday world, is not where it's at. Can I say that? Not where it's at, baby? But the ultimate truth is somewhere beyond the here and now, beyond the everyday. That was the younger Buber, or the Buber before reaching the notions of I and thou, excuse me, of dialogue. The book that we refer to as I and thou, in German is much simpler. Thou sounds very remote, odd perhaps, churchly if you wish. The German is very simple, so you'll forgive me if I give you a quick lesson in German. In German it's ich, which is I, und, and du. The word du, du, has a very special valence, special weight in German. German, like French and Italian, and Old English, had two terms, has two terms for you. Formal you is Sie. If you turn to your teacher, you'll say Sie. If you meet Dove in the corridor, you may want to say du, but you'll probably have to say Sie. Du is reserved in German. I don't know about your generation, but certainly the generation of your grandparents and Buber. Today it's a bit cool to refer to people du, but nonetheless, it's reserved for very special relationships. Du, that's the more intimate, personal pronoun, reserved for relationship between parents and their children. Between very, very good friends. And when I say very, very good friends, I can add another very, 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 very good friends. Martin Buber was what we would call, certainly in Israel, and I imagine in the United States, certainly in the Midwest, was a very good friend of Franz Rosenzweig, another philosopher with whom he worked very closely, almost on a daily basis, in a project to revive Jewish education and spirituality, and particularly to translate the Hebrew Bible into German, but would echo the Hebrew. Not just a translation, but a translation which captured the texture, the tone of the Hebrew Bible. And that was, of course, a very major project. They were, for all those years, per Sie. They spoke to one another, they addressed one another per Sie, as with the word Sie. Not this more friendly term, du. After 8 years of this intense interpersonal relationship, Franz Rosenzweig, who was also, by chance, a very ill man, wrote a poem in which he asked Buber permission to address him per du. In German, you even have a verb, duzen. You get to the point where you feel you can address someone as du, you say zu duzen. Imagine, I would say you. How would you do in English? But you can't. But you have in German. And then Buber responded, yes, we are ready. Note, yes, we are ready to refer to one another per du. And then Rosenzweig responded, I will now call you du, but in my heart I will continue to say Sie. Sie capturing a sense of respect and du, intimacy. In many respects, so I understand, this little book, translated in English as I and Thou, is, if you forgive the term, a phenomenology of saying du. Going into the consciousness, the sensibility that informs that grand moment of saying du. It's almost ceremonious, particularly amongst, I taught in Germany for many years as well. And when your colleague feels that, after you have tenure, of course, that you're ready to refer to one another do, the moment of silence is a very solemn moment. Dürfen wir jetzt duzen? Can we now? Dürfen is a very polite way of saying, may we? And then you broke in a cold sweat. I made it. You can imagine when young men and women go to, or lovers of any sort, come to that moment when they say, we can address one another as dude. Wow. It's the great moment of exaltation. What I wish to indicate that is, of course, there's a very special weight attached to it. And what is the nature of that weight? It is the heart of I and thou. I should mention one other moment in which we address someone with the word du, and that is God. Although God is referred to as the King of the universe, the Lord of the universe, in prayer we say du to God. And that is one of the reasons that the translator wished to capture that religious moment of dutzen, of saying du, by rendering that little word du, thou in English. It doesn't quite work, but there it is. But let me expand upon this, what Buber means by, or as I understand Buber saying, that du is a very special word. Not the word, but the act of turning to someone per du. And he emphasizes when concerned to someone per du without using the word, still saying sie. And one can even use the word du and somehow mean sie. It's more of an attitude. The book opens up, as you perhaps know, and says that there are two fundamental attitudes that characterize our interpersonal relations, our intersubjective relations. The German word is Haltung. There are other words for relation. It suggests the way you hold yourself, the way you orient yourself to the other. If I was teaching you in Hebrew, I would say, in Hebrew we make a distinction, do it in English, but not as strong in Hebrew. We make a distinction between hearing, the shmoa, and lakshiv. And lakshiv means in Hebrew attentive listening. But you can listen without speech, of course. And what Buber meant by the story about the event of the soldier, the distraught soldier who eventually committed suicide, he heard him, but he failed to really to listen. Lakshiv, attentive listening, which is beyond words. So what Buber is driving at in the I and Thou is that moment of dialogue. It's a term we actually introduced after I have written this book. The I Thou Haltung, the way you hold yourself, is very different than seeing another human being as an object. Not in the crude sense, but a person who's an object for admiration, for accepting your views, and the like. We all know that we encounter people and are encountered by others in this fashion, that we are somehow an object of the other person's ego, ambition, need, etc. Now, I Thou is of a very different type of posture. Is listening to the reality of the other, the presence of the other. If we had time, I would go into the vocabulary of this book as it is in German. But there's one distinction I thought I'd like to indicate. The German word for an object, this microphone, or forgive me, I'm a pantheist, so I'm actually asking forgiveness from the microphone. You as well. Is an object. The German word is Gegenstand, something that stands over against you. And Buber interplays with that with another term, and it's called Gegenwart. Gegenwart means something that waits over against you. Another human being waits over against us, not only stands opposite us, waits for a response, not to the superficial details of that person, but to his or her presence, Gegenwart. When Buber speaks theologically, God is also referred to as a Gegenwart, waiting over against us for a response to God's address. It's not a metaphysical address, but it's an address within a particular moment. So what is Buber really, as I began to say, driving at? The care, the nurturance of the moment he really can say fully do to another, enter that type of relationship. Remember, Buber and Rosenzweig were friends. Their children played together. Their wives met cordially, and but 8 years it took them to feel ready to gain the trust that characterizes do. Buber notes that the Hebrew term for faith, emunah, means trust, which he juxtaposed, he contrasted to the notion of pistis, which you may know from the word epistemology, knowledge. God says this, God does this. We affirm these truths about God. That's pistis. Emunah is trust. We're all vulnerable to being hurt, misunderstood, and to achieve that level of trust requires that careful nurturance. We no longer feel vulnerable before the other. A friend of Buber's, very famous psychiatrist and philosopher, probably forgotten about him or never knew about him, but if you go to the library, you can go to the card catalog, you know about him. Karl Jaspers, one time a very important philosopher associated with what we call existentialism, sought to elaborate what Buber had in mind. And he took the example of a snail. As you know, snails live within armor and would exit that armor very reluctantly. And as soon as there's a shadow of a threat, they crawl back into their shell. And such as human beings, we have shells that we create in many, many ways. Our titles, our position, the glasses that we purchase, and the like. In many subtle ways, we seek to protect ourselves from the threat of being hurt. To exit the shell, we need to trust that the other will not hurt us, will accept our presence. And that's what Buber has in mind by dialogue. And of course, there's a risk. You may emerge from the shell thinking the other person is ready to grant you that trust, and you're hurt. Abused, and it's called mismeeting by Buber. Meeting is the term that Buber uses for a dialogical mutuality. It's rare, it's difficult, but it's what makes life, or renders life full. Renders us the possibility of achieving a recognition of who we are in our depth. That, briefly, is Buber's vision of dialogue. But he spins that notion back into the Hebrew Bible and other phenomena of religion. I should mention, and this is crucial, that in this book, I and Thou, in which he introduced the notion of dialogue, of the I-you relationship, the ish-du relation. Another term I can use for you is, if we read it in German, Buber makes a distinction between two types of relations. The German does. The I-thou relation, ish-du, comes with the word for relation, Beziehung, which has in German a sense of pulling, a mutuality. There's another term in German for relation, which is more used in mathematics or spatial relations, Verhältnis. Buber insists that he's speaking about a Beziehung, this more dynamic, mutual character of an I-thou relation. The I-it can be, of course, static. I'm using you, I'm abusing you, I'm looking for your response in favor of whatever I wish to present to you. any event, Buber turned to excuse me, I forgot to say something. This book in which he discusses this concept of an I, thou, beziehung, relation, mentions two Jews. One is Jesus and the other is Peter. No rabbi, forgive me, Dov, and doesn't even mention Spinoza. Certainly not Moses Mendelssohn. But the only two Jews he mentions, Peter in passing and Jesus more extensively. And he mentions far more than Peter or Jesus, the Buddha and the Tao of Confucianism. Buber draws upon all human experiences to illustrate the challenge and the promise of a life of dialogue. But beyond that, he also turned to the Jewish sources, the Hebrew Bible, and particularly to this, the mystical movement known as Hasidism. There's a gentleman here, I've forgotten your first name, but he wrote on the founder of the movement.
Josh.
Excuse me?
Josh.
Josh wrote on the founder of a paper on the founder of the movement, the Baal Shem Tov of the Hasidic movement. So he can tell you all about the movement with greater profundity than I can. But Buber saw the Hebrew Bible as articulating in its depth the notion of emunah, trust. God created the world, and behold, it is good. In fact, very good. But of course, we experience the world often very differently. But we're called upon to trust the ultimate goodness of life, even though we often experience it differently. And Buber then elaborates various passages and events in the Bible to indicate that this is the core of biblical faith. Similarly, when he turns to Hasidism, Hasidism has, as I indicated, a mystical tradition, but it also, its heart is, according to Buber, to be found not in its mystical teachings, but in its stories, its tales, its sayings, maxims, all reflect the possibility of meeting God, not only meeting God, but the challenge of meeting God in the Hasidic parlance, with the language of the Bible, of Hasidism, in the marketplace. It's much more difficult to meet God in the marketplace. And he has a marketplace, an East European marketplace or an Israeli marketplace. If you ever visit me in Jerusalem, I'll take you to the market, you're pushing and you get those tomatoes and you're arguing, no, it's cheaper by that guy. It's a horror. And yet, the challenge of meeting people in the everyday sphere, in the marketplace, is far more difficult than going to the synagogue or the church or the mosque and turn to God. The everyday sphere. Remember I mentioned that as a mystic, Buber felt that the everyday world is an impediment to a more elevated existence. With his turn to dialogue, it's precisely in the everyday sphere where we have many mismeanings, that we're often abused, that we feel vulnerable, that we have the challenge to serve God, to respond to God. And responding to God for Buber is refracted, is mediated by our interpersonal relations. And such he draws out of particularly the teachings of the Hasidim, that when we respond to another human being in a dialogical fashion, we're also responding to the divine that is represented by that human being. Mati felt I should indicate the relevance, but I think I need not spell it out. I think we all realize that we live in the everyday, and so it can be brutal. And I mentioned the Dov, and this is really off the cuff and probably not proper, but the university can be brutal. You're graded, you're evaluated. Our languages, he's brilliant, he's not so brilliant. That's competitive. And that's true of the faculty. We have publish or perish, and that can really destroy a person's soul. Not just because the person becomes anxious, but it can distort the way we look at the world and ourselves, and as students as well. But although it's a reality, somehow within that reality, Buber would say that we have to be attentive to the other, hoping that they will be attentive to us, that in crucial moments we will be able to exit our shells and meet one another in trust. So I'll end and say to all of you, do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a little bit of time.
Yes, certainly. If you have any questions,
More dialogue.
don't be afraid. There's no grading.
From you, maybe from my students.
You know, I tell my students often, I say, if you're going to ask a question and you're a little embarrassed, I'll turn my back.